Welcome to our first LIDC lecture on interdisciplinarity and international development. We're very pleased to have such a good audience for this new venture. London International Development Centre, you may know about. I'm Jeff Fogg, I'm its director. I suspect many of you are members, but some of you are not. So I'll just mention that we were set up in 2008 as an initiative in interdisciplinary collaboration in the area of international development across colleges in the Bloomsbury set of colleges, including London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, who are hosting this lecture tonight. International development is complex by nature, and there's a long tradition of unidisciplinary and unisectoral interventions around international development that have been, in many cases, unsuccessful. And although you can make a lot of progress by focusing on just one approach to a development problem, often there are shortcomings of that as well. And one of the ways in which we've learned that in the last 15 years has been through the Millennium Development Goals. And because our member colleges are themselves quite specialized in areas such as agriculture and development, veterinary science, education, public health, it's logical that an intercollegiate activity on development in LIDC was to be itself an interdisciplinary one. Across our colleges, we do specialized development work in different sectors, like, say, agriculture, health, environment, but also in different disciplines, like economics and political science, sociology, anthropology, biology. And therefore, we have a rather broad definition of interdisciplinarity here, that is, interactions which are both across sectors and across disciplines within sectors. That's what we mean by that within LIDC. Now, over the past 5 years, we found it has been very exciting and interesting to bring researchers from our different colleges together in interdisciplinary dialogues. And it's led to a number of new initiatives. It's been actually quite successful, almost surprisingly so, our colleges think, in terms of new training courses. For instance, a new master's course that links veterinary and public health around the new concept of One Health. In research projects, such as a number of research projects now that are linking agriculture and environment with nutrition and health. And also in programs such as ones we've been doing with different colleges which train professionals, doctors, pharmacists, and veterinarians, to think in a broader context about the development dimensions of what they work, or what their work is, and what they'll be doing when they become accredited in those professions. Now, all of these projects have had some direct benefit to the staff and students who are interested in that particular area, like One Health, or agriculture and health, or development and veterinary science, and so on. But it's also proven in LIDC that to be a bit of an exploration about what it means to do interdisciplinary research and how to do that well. So besides actually creating these activities, we've become more and more aware there's an interesting question here about how do you do things in an interdisciplinary manner, and how do you do things better, which of course interests us because that's our bread and butter. We've been surprised by the interest of our members in stepping out of their silos and working across silos. That's been quite an active program in that regard. Usually younger members, as evidenced in the age of this audience tonight, are more amenable to interdisciplinary approaches than older ones. And we've been very surprised by the way in which it's been easy to develop funding for projects that take an interdisciplinary approach. In fact, that seems to be a bit of a trend today. So we have the view that we can probably improve the formula of fostering interdisciplinary collaboration in academia by making it an academic subject itself, by studying what makes it work. We have not done a lot of that ourselves. There are people who make a career out of looking at interdisciplinary in academia, but we'd like to begin to introduce into our LID thinking and dialogue, and with our members, academic staff, and students, a bit of an introspection about what it means, which might help us do better and help you in your interests in this area. So what we'd like to do in the next years is to have an annual lecture on interdisciplinarity, to which we will invite lead thinkers working in this area to share their thoughts and wisdom with us on what makes interdisciplinarity and what makes it work. And we hope that this lecture will stimulate interest in activities in LIDC. Because you're all here, you're probably interested in interdisciplinarity, and if you're members of any of the Bloomsbury Colleges, the Royal Vet College, Birkbeck Institute of Education, SOAS, or the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, then not members of LIDC, then you should join, because it's a good interdisciplinary activity. And if you want to join, when we have our drinks later downstairs, there's information on that. You can join through our website. You would be joining 3,000 members, academics and students and alumni in LIDC. And also, I'd like to say that this lecture begins this year and will begin in future a seminar series that's held weekly following this lecture on understanding international development, at which we bring together experts from different colleges to look at similar problems from their own perspectives. And this year we have a bit of an emphasis on looking at how one does impact evaluation and development. And you can find materials about that in the room in our drinks downstairs. So how we're going to run this evening is we're going to have a guest lecture, after which we'll have some questions and answers, and then we're going to invite everybody downstairs for a drink and a bit of networking and discussions, and in the cafeteria below. Now we're going to audio and video record this lecture, and photographs will be taken. So just so you know that, and if you don't want to be heard asking a question for some reason or seen asking a question, then just let us know that. Because we then distribute this lecture to all of our members who are sort of all over the world, and therefore we like to put it on video. So that's a bit about LIDC, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our very special speaker, Professor Peter Mollinga, who's a professor of development studies at the Department of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Peter was trained as an irrigation engineer in Wageningen University in the Netherlands. His PhD was on the political economy of irrigation water management in South India. He's a professor of development studies at SOAS, where he also heads the Center for Water and Development, and he's one of the founding editors of Water Alternatives, an interdisciplinary journal on water politics and development. But I got to know Peter not so much through water, but through the very important contributions he's made more generally to thinking about interdisciplinarity, and some of the concepts that he's introduced are very, very popular and very significant today. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Peter Mollinga as our first speaker in our series on interdisciplinarity and international development. Peter.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. It's a great honor to be here. I will stretch my neck this evening. It's overwhelming, this hall and this event. Let me do my best to share with you my experience with interdisciplinarity. You see I have a rather extended title here. It's a big topic. We have a metaphor here, boundary crossing, which is my favorite metaphor for the activity of interdisciplinarity. And then it says interdisciplinarity in natural resources management, research and development studies. Now, I find it difficult to make it shorter, but one of the points I will try and make is that to debate and develop approaches to interdisciplinarity, we may have to draw on bodies of literature and bodies of experience that are not exactly located in the field of international development. So that is possibly one of the messages of this talk. Let me situate where I talk from, because it's such a vast field. I will not do justice to quite a few currents of thinking in interdisciplinarity. I'm a very limited and biased person in that sense, so I'll tell you what my biases are. Like Jeff already said, my trajectory is that I started as a agricultural water resources engineer, trained in an agricultural university. So I learned how to design small-scale irrigation systems, looking at soils, waters, crops, structural engineering, a bit of topography and hydrogeology, and assemble that all in the act of design and engineering. I worked as an intern and during my studies in Senegal, and there in the design and creation of small-scale engineering after the Sahelian drought of the late 1970s in a development project. And it was partly in that project that I decided that development is not only about engineering. So, at some point in your life when you start as an engineer, you have to realize you need an experience perhaps like that. And mine was on the banks of the river Senegal, actually in Mauritania, on the Mauritanian frontier. So I went on to do a master's thesis on where I kind of studied how farmers actually manage these small, newly created development small-scale systems, and this luckily was not one of the disaster stories of development, but these systems actually totally new. Farmers had never irrigated in their life, but they spread like wildfire. So that was a very interesting question. So I started to look at the institutional aspects of water, and then in my PhD I did something similar but more in a political economy framework on large-scale irrigation in South India, on basically addressing the question, why is irrigation water distributed unequally? What are the political, economic, cultural, social and technological conditions that explain that kind of an inequality? So then I was had arrived firmly in the realm of development studies. Then in Wageningen University, where I worked with many colleagues who did similar things, I moved to the Center for we developed basically a program on research on water quality and water politics, the politics of water. So the department was called Irrigation and Water Engineering, and people always got very confused because they were all doing all this work on rights and justice and governance and gender relations in an engineering department. So we were doing a lot of social science. So I think that kind of explains the kind of lifelong, at least academic lifelong struggle or engagement I've had with both the technical and the social or political economy dimensions of water management. I then moved to the Center for Development Research in Bonn in 2004, where I was attracted to that institute because it was created after Bonn lost the capital status in Germany to Berlin, and then a lot of money was given to Bonn to build up a new international development-oriented knowledge base, and one of the institutes established there was the Center for Development Research, and it's one of the very few institutes that I know that was actually mandated to be interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinarity is usually, at least in academia, something that has to be created. You have to struggle to create space for. This was fully mandated, fully new, so I thought there's no better place to try and work on the question of interdisciplinarity there. And my main work has been in Uzbekistan in a project on sustainable land and water management to see how we could do that in an interdisciplinary way. And most of my kind of thinking on interdisciplinarity stems from that experience, as you will notice. So that's where my bias lies. I then finally moved back to development studies in a way, arriving at SOAS, which is the Social Science Institute. So where earlier I was in a position at Wageningen to sell social science to engineers, so to speak, now I'm in a position to sell natural and ecological sciences to social scientists. Both is roughly equally difficult in my experience. So it is a new chapter in my efforts to create a space for what I presently call critical water studies, which of an interdisciplinary kind. So that's where I thought talk from. To prepare this talk, so you can see from this history that my main location has been water and natural resource management questions. So to prepare this talk, I thought let me do at least a semi-systematic look at how interdisciplinarity and the term cross-disciplinarity, which seems to be popular nowadays, is being discussed in the domain of development studies itself. And I took a paper by John Harris, which the title of which is The Case for Cross-Disciplinary Approaches in International Development, or could you have a more appropriate title than this for this kind of a lecture? And of course, John Harris is a very, very well-known development scholar who usually writes excellent reviews and overviews, and this is one of them. So I, in my semi-systematic research, I Googled scholars this, and I found 137 places where this paper was cited, and I quickly went through all of them to get an idea of what kind of a debate do we have in the domain of development studies as regards the phenomenon of cross-disciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. Well, what I found, and this is a hypothesis, don't take it as a well-documented a systematic scoping review, as we nowadays want to do them. I found that within development studies, the debate in development studies journals, the debate on cross-disciplinarity is mostly about questioning the hegemony of economics as a discipline and making arguments for the value of anthropology, political science, sociology, and all kinds of other social science disciplines to show that we should have a broader and more interdisciplinary social science approach to development. I mean, that's the bulk of the debate. That surprised me a little bit, actually, that was so strong. The second thing, what I missed, and that's probably my own bias, there was very little explicit conceptual or programmatic reflection on the phenomenon of multi or cross or inter or transdisciplinarity. And there was very little connection with two debates that have been very influential for me, but which are outside the domain of development studies at least, maybe not outside the domain of international development, but certainly outside the domain of development studies as we do it. SOAS at least. Two debates, the social science and technology studies, or more broadly work on knowledge and knowledge development, knowledge processes, knowledge management, which is not at all specific to international development, but which has produced a lot of insight on the question of interdisciplinarity and the kind of area, what some would call sustainability science, particularly in the US, those who try to do socio-ecological interdisciplinary research on natural resource management in the broadest sense of the term. Neither of these debates, which I have found very stimulating for thinking about interdisciplinarity, have much reference in that development studies debate. Well, I don't want to make a big claim here because this may be an artifact of the limits of the methodology to look at have such a limited look, but it does resonate with my kind of impressionistic assessment of that. So I think Jeff is right, very right, and LIDC is right, that there is work to do, I think, to to facilitate more engagement, not just within the Bloomsbury Colleges, but also among the literatures that do have a lot to say about interdisciplinarity and all the other trans and cross versions of that, which may not be immediate development studies or international development related work. So I think that's one of the boundaries to cross. That is, think out of the box of international development and appropriate things from other areas. So that is the message here. Okay. So that's a long introduction. Let's get to the substance. In the call or the announcement of this lecture, there were three questions. and I will try to answer these more or less systematically. I'll very explicitly talk about the first one and then treat the others ones slightly more indirectly. The questions are, what is interdisciplinarity? What do we mean with that term in the first place? What can an interdisciplinary approach add to your own research? And how can interdisciplinary research inform projects on the ground? So the emphasis of the talk will be about how do we actually do that, what are this thing called interdisciplinarity, what problems do we encounter, how can they be overcome, what kind of ideas do we have on that? Okay, but to make this not too boring, let us start with something joyful, something nice. I have a quiz for you. So in the next slide, I will show you pictures of 3 people, portraits. One of them is a natural scientist, one of them is a social scientist, and one of them is an economist. 1, 2, 3. That's not necessarily the order, but there are 3 pictures. And I'll give you about 30 seconds to decide who is what. And then we'll vote. I'll ask you who you think who is what, and then see what will happen. Okay, here we are. So you have about 30 seconds. 3 people here. Now it works. Okay, here we go. Quizmaster. Who thinks that number 1 is the social scientist? There. Who thinks that number 1 is the natural scientist? Also very few. Who thinks that number 1 is the economist? Ah! Large majority. Okay, great. Who thinks that number 2 is the social scientist? You. Who thinks that number 2 is the natural scientist? Ah, great. So number 3 must be the social scientist. Okay, great. Well, you are totally in line with all the other audiences that I've done this with across the world, in different parts of the world, as well as with all kinds of nationalities, different disciplines. It's always the same. It's about 10-90 or 20-80, always this pattern. Now I'll tell you whether you're right or not. Well, I have no idea whether you are right. I actually don't know who these people are. I have no idea whatsoever. In 2004, when I first taught about interdisciplinarity, I asked my research assistant, find me 3 pictures on the internet that you think look like natural scientists, economists, and social scientists. And she came up with this. And it has been wonderful. Within 30 seconds, based on a portrait photo, there is a global consensus on the disciplinary identity of these 3 people. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us quite a few things. It tells us that we live with terrible stereotypes. Huh? How could it be so homogeneous? Of course, the woman must be the social scientist. Does that have to do anything with the pecking order of the sciences? Is there a connection, perhaps? And this person with a slightly badly dressed and the hair not totally straight, he must be a natural scientist. He is the stereotype of a mathematician or a physicist which we see in Hollywood movies and all kinds of other places. And the economist wears a suit and a tie, and he has a maximization thing at the back, so he must be an economist. Well, maybe, I don't know. So the second thing it tells us, so why do I show this? Because I think it illustrates a very main point. If we want to think about interdisciplinarity seriously and do something seriously, we have to be willing to question these kinds of basic, ingrained ideas. And here, this is of course just joyful and a joke, but this problem I think if you would reflect on some of your encounters with other disciplines, then you would probably recognize some of these patterns. I mean, interestingly, it's not totally fictitious, because the Center for Development Research, where I worked, had 3 directors. It was a very nice institute, and everything had to be decided by 3 directors, one from the natural sciences, one from economics, and one from the other social sciences, then economics. And they roughly, in the way they dressed and behaved, they roughly fitted the stereotypes. So it's not that it's just an idea, but it is actual practice in a way. There's a wonderful paper about interdisciplinarity in West Germany, late 1980s, just before the wall fell, so it's West Germany, and it investigates the cultural traits of different disciplines, and you can find patterns in terms of how different disciplines spend their leisure time, what they like to do, whether they like to go to the theater or do mountain biking. It's amazing how many cultural traits there are to disciplines. So message, interdisciplinarity is not only about knowledge and science and all the serious business of academia, but it is also very much about cultures and cultural images and processes. Okay, so I hope that today, at least for tonight, for the next 1.5 hours, you'll try to think out of the box and then go back to your normal practices, as we all do all the time, but maybe with a little bit of a different mindset. Okay. If we talk interdisciplinarity, it is perhaps useful to ask the question, why do we have disciplines in the first place? They haven't always been there. Till about 1700, there were only 7. I forgot them, but one of them was rhetoric, and several of them. In the late 19th century, this process of differentiating out of disciplines started, and it took an enormous, like many things in history, after 1950, it kind of exploded. The number of disciplines or specialties or fields that we have in science. Well, that is related to quite a few things. One of the things that is related to is that the process of industrialization and modernization and the specialization of knowledge in a knowledge-based society. So the creation of disciplines has been analyzed by some as the kind of the scientific parallel of the Taylorism in industry, a division of labor that is both meant to increase productivity as well as meant to increase control of the labor process. So that's one line. For the international development, decolonization is a very important element. For example, the role and prominence of area studies after decolonization. And there is also very secular processes like the explosion of admission of people to universities, particularly from the 1970s, enormous increase in student numbers and therefore expansion of universities, and that led to specialization and several other factors. So it's important, I think, to realize that disciplines are not given. Kind of the big divisions of the large group, sociology, physics, that is pretty stable, but below that, at lower levels of aggregation, more specialized levels, there is a lot of dynamics also. We are creating new disciplines by the tens every year. If you understand discipline as a chair or a field or a specialty. I'll give you, so one of the processes happening in that is the process of hybridization, as some would have called it in the 1990s. I'll give you 3 examples. One of the things we do in the history, in academic history, is to take small pieces of existing disciplines, put them together and start a new discipline. That's a very, very common process. It's not all of the specialization, but it's an important part of specialization. And here are a few examples. I've chosen these because there are good papers on these that describe the history of how that specialization happened. A phenomenon called genetic toxicology, which was fought for between 1968 and 73, got itself established and is now a very burgeoning field, for example, looking at what environmental pollution does to DNA makeups of fish and other organisms. So, another field with a long history is ethnobotany, so that's across, while genetic toxicology is within the natural sciences, ethnobotany is a combination of anthropology, among other things, and botany, so that's across the natural and the social sciences. And then political geography is a typical example within, no, not necessarily only the social sciences, but there are endless lists of this. Economic anthropology, and etc. So SOAS also has quite a few of them, and you can make your own list. So this has led some people to ask, if this is what's happening, then ironically, interdisciplinarity seems to be a normal process in disciplinary science. But at a certain point, we call this hybrid. First, it starts as a collaborative project, and at a certain moment, it becomes settled, and then we call it a discipline. Isn't that strange? When you have a journal, and a building, and a chair, and a professional society, and a language, then you are a discipline. So a discipline is very much an academic, institutional artifact, or it is socially constructed. A discipline is basically what we decide to call a discipline. So where then so this makes you cautious about making simple opposition between disciplinary and interdisciplinary work. That is, I think, one lesson. Nevertheless, I think the term of interdisciplinarity is not obsolete, because this is still specialization. These are not mergers of whole fields, but these are mergers and combinations and reinventions of pieces of fields. Not all of ethnography and not all of botany, but just the necessary part of it that you need to address a particular issue. So it's still specialization. And interdisciplinarity is in many respects the counterpoint of this type of specialization. And we'll come to that in a minute. So, but be aware that there's nothing natural about disciplines. And the closer you look at that, that's why you see these papers are more than interesting in to see how these fields get socially constructed. Okay. So why are disciplines then not enough? If they are hybrid, even if when they are hybrid, I think in the literature there are basically two answers to that question. This is John Harris's phrasing: academic disciplines need to be saved from themselves. That's one. Let's say that's the critical moment. And the second reason is disciplines can't understand and address complexity. That's the, let's say, the instrumental moment of interdisciplinarity. Okay, what do I mean by this? What's the problem with disciplines? Now, the word itself is interesting because it has a number of connotations. It actually derives not from the English word discipline, and we normally use it in a general context, but it derives from the word disciple, follower. But it also has this connotation of discipline in being organized and systematic and coherent. I mean, one of the positive sides of discipline is obviously rigor, systematic approach, a disciplined approach to science. I mean, if you take it in that sense. But the kind of less simply positive things are this notion of followers and the notion of control. Discipline as control and discipline of following. So this is a quote from a science studies paper. Disciples of a discipline are disciplined to imply or suggest that the best way of understanding the world, or at least certain fields of the world, is through the specific discipline that they obey. And the word obey is, of course, obvious, deliberately chosen. So, if you want it slightly more poetically, basically the problem with disciplines is that they behave as tribes. This is an absolutely great book that you must read if you're interested in interdisciplinarity, and it basically analyzes science as a set of disciplinary science, as a set of tribes that are strongly territorial. And the metaphor should be taken pretty literally. What do disciplines do? They invent languages, they create boundaries, they create all kinds of rituals. They speak a language that fences and all for another. So what they do is boundary guarding in the social science and technology literature. They create fences, and discursive fences, institutional fences, cultural fences, economic fences sometimes. So they become territories. So that's the problem with discipline. Of course, there's no absolute necessity for that, but if I have worked in at least 3 academic institutions now, and I haven't been in one so far where there isn't a constant turf war, territorial struggle between the different departments or chairs or whatever the organizational structure may be. And one of my hypotheses, the closer people are, the harder they struggle to be separate. Sometimes it's the struggle among social science disciplines or among natural science disciplines is much more fierce than across the boundary. So for a sociology of organization and an ethnography of disciplinarity, I think you don't have to go far. You can just look at your own institute and you will find most of these processes. So read this book. It's a wonderful book, though not a very happy book. So that's the kind of, and that also refers us back to the 3 pictures. They illustrated that point rather simply. The second point is about why do we need interdisciplinarity? Because to analyze the complexity of the world, we can't do with only one discipline or simple combinations of disciplines. So there are many ways to phrase that point, but one of them is here. No specialized as disciplinary knowledge fits the needs to analyze complexity because none contains information about the interplay of numerous different elements, factors and functions, because they're all specialized. It's a very basic and simple point, and I think it's very true. The problem is not that people specialize, the problem is that they then claim that that is the privileged perspective for the world in general. I mean, and I don't think there's any discipline who is not a little bit guilty of that. So other ways to say that, more in the policy domain, is people have said disciplines can address tame problems. For wicked problems, interdisciplinarity is required. So wicked problems are complex problems which have no kind of simple solutions. And in a more philosophy of science mode, you would say interdisciplinarity is a critique of reductionism, because if you carve up a phenomenon into disciplinary parts, the issue with complexity is that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So if you are a critic of reductionism, and you believe that your ontology includes something like emergence or emergent properties, then disciplinarity is a problem, because it's not obvious how you combine these elements into a whole that is more than the sum of the parts. And there are other reasons, but I think this suffices. Okay. So here there are different kinds of complexity. I want to show you a diagram for the natural science. This is one of my favorite diagrams of a complexity. Well, what do we do when we analyze the world? We kind of carve out a particular phenomenon or a case or a situation or a process or a location in which many things are happening. In my case, it was water distribution in a canal irrigation system in India, and that is composed of a set of heterogeneous elements: canals, people, money, rice mills, politicians, farmers, male and female, rich and poor. So it's a whole set of things, and all of these things matter for making the system tick. And they have all kinds of complex relations. There are physical relations of water flow, there are market relations, there are relations of caste, there are relations, institutional governance relations, and all of that is part of the simple thing of distributing water for agriculture production. So that's complexity for you. So what do we do in disciplinary science? We look at individual or small sets of that. What is complexity science is that we try to understand the the properties of the whole, if you want. So, very sexy nowadays, complexity science. When I was a student, complexity was not on the cards at all, but the last 10, 15 years, it has become very, very frontier science, from electromechanics to social science to economics to ecological science. Okay. So there is to say a little bit more about complexity, there are different, what I've just described is a form of ontological complexity. Things are complex by what they are, particularly development situations, but in fact, your household is probably a complex system, I'm sure. Real systems are heterogeneous, they have a variety of relations, they are non-linear, and they're evolving over time, they're open systems. But there are other kinds of complexity as well. Societal complexity, I've called it, not a very nice phrase, but I don't know a better word. The fact is that if you take natural resource management as an example, natural resources are contested. In management systems like, say, water, not everybody has the same stake, not everybody has the same interest, and so there are no optimal solutions. What the best solution is, or best way forward is a matter of who you are. And one of the cruxes of development programs, including natural resource management, is how do we negotiate these trade-offs. That's what we call the science of politics, basically. A relatively civilized ways of negotiating differential interests. That's, I think, in my simple view, what politics is about. So, societal complexity, it means that you cannot just ask a scientist for the optimal solution, because there is a different kind of complexity at work, and a very different kind of complexity, analytical. It's pretty hard work to understand that. That's why we have disciplines. The world becomes much more amenable if you only look at part of it. If you really want to understand the whole, it's very difficult. Takes me a lot of difficulty, even for something simple as water management. So if you think this is all natural science, for those of you who think that complexity thinking is all about a natural science, then this is, I've only discussed the diagram, but this is to show that complexity thinking modeling is as prominent in social science as it is in natural science. So this is the history of modeling in the social science. So never step in that trap, that modeling and complexity science is something that is reserved for ecology and physics. So that, I hope, don't be afraid of models, even if you're an anthropologist. So what is the strongest challenge? I think, and it's not surprising in a way that natural resource management, environmental issues, ecological issues are so prominent in the thinking on interdisciplinarity, because they problematize one of the most naturalized divides in our thinking, that between nature and society. Since Descartes, so to speak, we think about nature and society as two different things. And then the act of interdisciplinarity supposedly is to draw arrows between them. They interact. So ontologically, it's very strongly ingrained in our thinking. It's also very difficult to say it differently in speech. We think of nature and society as very different things, as ontologically different things. And here's an example from a very famous water scholar. And how do you recognize this? When someone draws a diagram with boxes, one box for nature and one box for science, and an arrow between them, then you can say Cartesian divide. Then we have what's the problem with that? Since climate change, but actually much longer, we know that they are not separate objects. And certainly for me, like a Dutchman, it's actually a strange thought. I live in a country that wouldn't exist if nature and society were separate things. We've actually engineered every piece of nature in there's not a square meter that is not engineered in my country. And we still have nature conservation. That was not deliberate. So there is a real problem with that separation. And it's been documented very well in geographical literature, in the science and technology literature, in political ecology. There's a huge number of research, a huge amount of research that problematizes that. And it is very difficult to think it differently. So we have this, for example, Swijngenda's piece of techno-natural landscapes. We have socio-ecological systems. We have hydrosocial cycles. We have socio-nature. So we are creating nowadays all kinds of hybrid terms to try and speak about nature and society in one go, so to speak, rather than flip-flopping between the two. And I think that's the reason why, because it's so fundamental to our present-day contemporary problems, the notion of the Anthropocene, if you are familiar with it, will now also be codified, that we live in the Anthropocene. We live in an age where the natural environment is fundamentally shaped by human beings, and we can no longer think of it as an external thing, even if that was warranted ever in history. So, hence, we have a lot of thinking in the domain of natural resources, environment, ecology, to how can we bridge that divide? How can we bridge the gap between the natural and the social sciences and conceive of a nature society whole? So, okay, I won't go into that, of course, but this should be enough to make this the answer to the first question somewhat intelligible. This is my favorite typology of the different types of trans, inter, multi, cross-disciplinarity. It comes in five. This is taken from a publication on land use planning and things like that. So the crucial thing in this diagram are two things. Who defines the problem that research is addressing, and who is addressing it? Who is involved in addressing it? So, in disciplinary science, it is academics, researchers who define the problems, all in their own disciplinary silo. That's the top diagram. Unencumbered, at least ideologically, by others. Science for science sake, this is the kind of imagery here. What is multidisciplinarity? Multidisciplinarity is the act in which a group of disciplinary scientists decides that they want to work on the same theme, on the same issue, all define their own problem in that, and then have some process of debate and conclusion drawing that tries to draw it together. So typical multidisciplinary report, you can recognize as chapters on different disciplines and then a concluding chapter. That's typical, very disciplinary chapters, and then it's a very typical structure. Then I'll jump to interdisciplinarity. What then distinguishes interdisciplinarity is this act of joint problem framing. So we're not just discussing the same broadly defined thematic, let's say sustainability or migration or something like that, but we actually force ourselves to have a shared research question, the same question for everyone that we jointly address. That's what interdisciplinarity is about. And you can see there is all kinds of... I know a project on water management in the Danube who tried to do research. It was a 5-year project that took half a year in the beginning to actually come to a joint question. And I found that not nearly long enough. So that's the act of problem framing, joint problem framing. If you want to say it kind of flippantly, you would say lock people in a room and let them not come out before they have a joint question, because otherwise you will default to multidisciplinarity because of the tribalism and territorialism. It's really a difficult thing to do to come to a joint problem definition. And it's not just for institutional reasons, but also for intellectual reasons. Now, so that's kind of disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. That all can happen within the walls of academia. You don't have to go outside, so to speak. When does this become something else? Is that when not only researchers or academics are involved in this process, but you also involve stakeholders or interest groups or users or the public in the process of problem framing and sometimes even the execution of the research. Now we have two models here presented. Participatory research, which is basically disciplinary or multidisciplinary research where scientists and non-academics discuss, deliberate. You can think of planning processes, public planning processes where scientists meet people in a neighborhood and they discuss, etc. And then you have transdisciplinarity where the non-academic part is actually part of the problem framing. So non-researchers are involved in actually telling what the problem is and defining it, and often in the implementation of the research. So it's, I would say, transdisciplinarity is interdisciplinarity plus stakeholders, so to speak, if you want a simple formula. So if you want to say slightly more politically, you would say transdisciplinarity is democratized science of an interdisciplinary kind. That is slightly more provocative, probably. So I think this, for me, this has held pretty well in characterizing different types of research in the scale. It's certainly not the only terminology, all the terminology around. We have cross-disciplinarity, which is usually a vague, a relatively open term to refer to most of this, except disciplinarity. We have supra-disciplinarity, we have interdisciplinarity, and we have several other terms. So if you read the literature, you'll be confused, but I think this is a reasonably robust typology. So when do we need transdisciplinary research? Because kind of transdisciplinary research is the kind of extreme version. Joint problem framing, everybody involved, democratized science, and this is from our Swiss colleagues who work on interdisciplinarity and natural resource management in Europe particularly, reflected on that. So who, and I use this slide to say, who are the drivers of this move towards interdisciplinarity and particularly transdisciplinarity? Is it academia or is it someone else? Well, if you look at that historically, it's not academia generally that drives the move from disciplinarity to interdisciplinary transdisciplinary. It's research funders in the last decades, particularly EU, for example, in my own field, water, has been an enormous funder of making efforts at interdisciplinary compulsory in research grants, and it's the corporate sector. Some of the most innovative work on interdisciplinarity is actually done in the corporate sector. The OECD has a report on interdisciplinarity and the need for it in the early 1980s. Not with all kinds of, in a sense, in an instrumental problem fixing, making science more relevant mode. So, unfortunately, I think, though I'm an academic myself and a committed one, it must unfortunately be said that the momentum for this change or increase of space does not primarily lie in the academic domain, with, of course, quite a few exceptions to that. So here's an example. If you want to recognize or kind of do a quick test for what kind of research we have at hand, many people nowadays have to claim that they are interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary because that's what gets you funding. So I'm trying not to be cynical, but I must admit that I've become a little bit cynical in the process of trying to do this as well. And I'm guilty as pleaded. I have been part of this system very much. So one of the most interesting thing to do because transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity are often done in teamwork in large projects, particularly in a EU or large research framework. And then you have work packages. Is an organizational structure of this collaborative research to address a very important societal problem. And if you don't want to read the 100-page document that is a proposal, but if you want to look at the organigram and the list of work packages. And here's an example from a project I was involved in myself in Uzbekistan, phase 2 of our project in Uzbekistan. And if you would look at the right column, you would see, of course, the whole discourse of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity was there, but if you then look at the work packages, they are very nicely disciplinary divided. And then at the end of the project, there is a big integrator. In this case, the chosen integrator was an integrated model. So here you see it in the diagram. You have 4 disciplinary fields, basically, and then some modeling that has to bring all this together. This, of course, didn't work very well. I mean, I say, of course, but because there was a problem with joint problem framing, and this stimulated territorialism quite a bit. In the third phase, we try to do it in a different way, and if you're interested to know about that, please ask me in the question time. But this is it's pretty typical. Google work package in images, and you'll find many examples like this in all kinds of things. So, here we are. So I hope I've reasonably answered first question, and second question, what can an interdisciplinary approach add to your own research? Well, what it can basically do analytically is to understand complexity better than you would be able to do within a disciplinary framework. And critically, it helps you to protect yourself against tribal territorialism, so to speak, to get totally enmeshed in your own field. Whether you think these are valuable things, of course, is a different matter. My plea is not for everybody to become an interdisciplinary scientist. That would be not very helpful. This building would not stand without disciplinary science, so I'm not arguing against disciplinary science as such, but I'm arguing for a slightly more space and for grounded interdisciplinary research. Okay, so the rest of my talk, which will not be very long, because we are running out of time, how can interdisciplinary research inform projects on the ground? So how do we do it, and what are the problems? How easy or difficult is it to be an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary researcher? Problem 1 is language. I'll just kind of do a very selective tour through the literature of interdisciplinarity by examples, not even giving you the rest. One of the most enlightening experience for me was when I had an Italian PhD student who was working on land reform and land policy, and I said to him, a very useful framework is to look at the politics of policy. So, the contested nature, the political nature of policy processes. In English, you can say that without a problem. Phrases from Merrily Grindle from the late 1970s has been around in policy analysis for quite some time. In also my own language, Dutch, you can easily say that. De politieke dimensies van beleid. 2 different words. But then the Italian student came and he said, if you want to make your career in Italy with this concept, you better think of something else. Because in my language, the word for politics and policy is the same word. Politica, if I remember. And it's like that in Russian, in Finnish, in Spanish, in French, in German. So you actually can't sensibly say the politics of policy in most languages that I have a faint familiarity with. I have no idea about Chinese and South Asian languages. I don't know what. So this is just to illustrate that there is sometimes even pretty banal, even at the heart of our concepts, there may be language problems. Another example is the notion of efficiency across different domains, and there are endless numbers of examples of that. It's not only about paradigms or definitions, it is actually sometimes about the language as such, and it's not easy to negotiate. So language is different, and it's a huge topic in interdisciplinary research. It's a common language, and the usual response of natural sciences is to, and also many social sciences, is to, we need a clear set of definitions to begin with, otherwise we can't collaborate. Well, that's will probably kill any interdisciplinary project, because the interesting thing is actually that the meanings are different. I mean, how interdisciplinarity is about finding shared meanings, or that's one of the things that interdisciplinarity is about. Second problem, indeed, paradigms. Your philosophical standpoint. I often ask when I teach nowadays and PhD students in math, how many of you have done a basic course in the philosophy of science? So do you know the meaning of ontology, epistemology, the foundation? Could you summarize the philosophical foundation of your research when they wake you up in the night in a paragraph? Well, unfortunately, one of the effects of the modernization of university education has been that we no longer do that in most places. So most of us walk around with very implicit notions of the foundations of the way we look at the world and the type of knowledge that is possible about it, and because it is implicit, we can't imagine it could be otherwise. So once a very colleague of mine in Wageningen, I was in irrigation, he was in soil and water conservation. We were, let's say, the strongly social science influence department. They were the natural science complex systems modeling department. And he was a very good friend and a respected colleague. And in the corridor one day he said to me, "Peter, what you are doing in your department, that's not really science, is it?" And so I found that so telling, that the point is not to criticize this person, but the point is to say we sometimes find it very difficult to imagine, to actually think of out of our box, because we don't even know that we're in a box. And one of the boundaries of that box are our basic assumptions about ontology and epistemology. Okay. Third problem, much discussed in the organization, in the interdisciplinary organization and incentives. If you read the literature, many of people will say, interdisciplinarity, don't do that early career. It's far too risky. Wait till you're well established and then you can take the risk. Because if you want to make a risk, there's this insidious thing called tenure track. It disciplines in the literal sense of stay within your box. And go to the reputed journal. I notice it with young scholars. They are feel very constrained in not publishing in the kind of the best thing in their discipline. So I hope I am a living example of that. You can also make a career with radically disobeying that. So don't be desperate. But there is, of course, a lot of institutional pressure. It's about funding. It's about organizational structure, about peer review, etc. So there is a lot of that in the debate. And then, particularly if we talk about transdisciplinarity, there is this idea of stakeholder is, of course, very right, but whom do you include and whom do you exclude, or how does that process happen? And this is a very nice picture from Pakistan, I think it is, or somewhere in that part of the world. It may also be from India, I don't know. And what we see here is a participatory approach, research, and if you look carefully at the picture, of course, the people sitting in the front are the men, particularly old men, and just peeping at the meeting at the back are women and children. So it's kind of a simplistic illustration of the problem of, if you go this route of, let's say, democratized, inclusive, stakeholder-driven science, you face this problem. Who are the stakeholders and what are the balance of power in that group? So that's roughly the scope of issues. Now, should we be too impressed by all these problems? Can we solve them? Do we have material, instruments, tools, approaches, ideas to address them? Yes, we have. And this, we should be grateful to the Swiss Academy of Sciences, because they have established something called a TDNet, a transdisciplinary network, and I hope it still works. This is their website in English. And then we go to bibliography, the archive of the bibliography, and then here this is your resource base for thinking about how do I do interdisciplinarity. give you just one example. Let us take tools. Well, these are all the tools, and then that's problem framing somewhere here. Here we go. And this is just one subcategory. So why do I show this? Anyone who claims that interdisciplinarity is just an idea or transdisciplinarity is just an idea, go and look at this. There is, for each and every element of that process, you can find people writing about how they've done it, how it could be done, how it hasn't worked, how it didn't work. So I always show this to say we are not in the sphere of intentions. We now have a huge literature of the practice of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. It helps when you read German, because that German language is one of the areas where there is a lot to read. Switzerland, Austria, and Germany are very active in this field, but also in English. And so make use of it. The problem is that there is resistance to somehow make use of that in project design. My favorite example, in the third phase of this Uzbekistan project, we lobbied for a person, a staff member in the project, responsible for facilitating the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary process, and to be able to source this literature and make use of it in a practical sense, doing the project. Now, scientists, academics in my institute interpreted that as a choice between an extra PhD or postdoc or a facilitator. And we got it accepted in that project to appoint a staff member for particularly to facilitate and the organization of interdisciplinarity within the project, but it's the only project we ever did it. And the gut reaction was, I'd rather have an extra PhD student or a postdoc than some unclearly defined communication, facilitation, process person, which we don't know exactly what he or she will do. I mean, I'm caricaturing a bit, but not very much. And so I think that, another test you can do, how many resources in interdisciplinary projects are devoted to actually making the process happen? And you'll be shocked, is my prediction. That is. It's usually a management component, but that's not exactly what I mean. I mean explicit attention to process facilitation and addressing all these problems that I've just outlined. Very rare to see it, at least in natural resource management. So, some basic ideas. I'll go very quick now, just to whet your appetite. This is a long quote, which I would normally read, but I think one of the ironies of the discussions on interdisciplinarity is that interdisciplinary, at the end of the day, is perhaps only very partially about disciplines. Chaitanya Lele, who works on forestry in India, great interdisciplinary work. He argues, I think he says it's basically a red herring to always oppose the economist to the natural scientist to the sociologist, for instance. That is actually a misrepresentation of the problem. It's not so much the disciplinary fields, but underlying that is, if you want, the paradigm. If you get neo-institutionally minded sociologists, economists, and modeling-oriented natural scientists in one room, there's not much of a communication problem. If you get Marxist sociologists, economists, and a Marxist biologist, they really exist. There's a book called The Dialectical Biologist, 1984, Richard Levin, Richard Levin, a great book. Not much of a communication problem. So the argument here is don't get distracted, don't step into that trap of pitting one discipline against the other, because usually the problem is about something else. It's about how we see the world, what types of frameworks we want to use, what types of theory we want to employ. So that's one kind of unsettling kind of a thing, perhaps, but also a hopeful thing, because we shouldn't be so pessimistic about all these problems. The mismatch in that where I worked was that we had positivist natural scientists and economists, and then we had critical realists and relativists, social scientists. That didn't work. If we would have had positivist sociologies, it would have worked perfectly. That's the point. Okay, that's one. Second, to repeat what I've already said, this is from Julie Klein, an American professor of interdisciplinary studies. She's written 2 great books about interdisciplinarity, and one of the titles of that book is Crossing Boundaries. So that's where the metaphor comes from. And she distinguishes between instrumental and critical interdisciplinarity. There is interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity for problem fixing, and there is interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity for social transformation. So we have a very diverse constituency for advocating, political constituency advocating interdisciplinarity. The first wave of interdisciplinarity of the 1970s and 80s was very much critical interdisciplinarity, development studies, environmental studies, things like that, on the wave of social movements. The second wave of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity is very much instrumental and problem-fixing oriented. OECD, the EU, the corporate sector, they are the advocates of interdisciplinarity at the moment. The main advocates, not the others. So I think it is about the purpose of interdisciplinarity. So one is about building bridges, others is about questioning assumptions and transforming society. This I will skip. I want to spend the last few minutes of my talk on presenting you a framework. Or sketching it rather. How can we organize this kind of enormous breadth of literature and thinking and problems? Because I just sampled and it's hopefully pretty chaotic. Now, how do we organize it? Well, there are several proposals for that. Here's my proposal. I propose to think of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity as boundary work. It's not my word. It's a word that comes from sustainability science and from the social studies of science and technology, around from the 1980s. And the idea is that interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity is basically about finding ways to productively negotiate boundaries. Whether they are socially constructed or not is in a way immaterial. The reality is that we have difficulties with these boundaries. So these are knowledge boundaries, these are cultural boundaries, as we saw in the beginning, these are political boundaries, these sometimes literal national boundaries, and these are also research policy interface boundaries. So there are many boundaries to cross. So how do we do that work of boundary crossing? Well, here's my framework. I think we need to do 3 things. Develop what I would call boundary concepts. We need to be able to think multi-dimensionality. Nature and society in one go and not separately. How do we do that? What concepts do we actually have for that? Well, except just hybridizing them. That's just the beginning of that. But thinking is not enough. If we want to do this, we need to have devices, things that help us to actually make that process of boundary crossing happen. They're called in the literature boundary objects. So that allow us to act. Because acting is more than talking. It's not just about concepts, but it's about doing things. Particularly when it's transdisciplinary research, when you want to actually make changes in the world. And the third one is, under what conditions do we do? We have to shape the settings or the relations, the conditions of possibility and impossibility that facilitate this work. So there's a boundary setting. We have to enable our work. Now, boundary concepts are those concepts that allow us to capture the multidimensionality of something in one concept, rather than having separate concepts. This is my own for water control. The act of water management, of water control, is simultaneously technical, organizational, and social economic. Can we develop a concept that captures all these 3? That's been my work of the past 20 years, to try and develop that. Another example that will be more familiar with you is the notion of ecosystems, goods and services. The debate on that started in 1968, roughly, late 1960s, to make ecologists and economists and other social scientists communicate with each other more productively. It was codified in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment document. Now it's a globally accepted terminology, though certainly not uncontested. So that's a boundary concept. What does that concept allow us to do? It's a vocabulary that all these disciplines can use. They may not mean exactly the same thing with it, but it is a conceptual tool, a conceptual space in which productive interaction is possible. So that's, and other examples in that too are vulnerability, resilience. These are all efforts to conceptualize the multidimensionality, the complexity of this. But as the ecosystem services example illustrates, it's hard work. It only took about 30 years to get from the initial concept to a kind of an acceptance. Water control we've been working on for 20 years. So this is not the fast route to interdisciplinarity. There are other shortcuts which we can discuss perhaps later. So that's an example of a boundary concept. Boundary objects are the things that often in the absence of coherent theoretical frameworks that we use to kind of facilitate that communication. It's a term from the social studies science literature, and imagine it is a thing, a device that allows us to interact across boundaries. One of the easiest examples is models. I mean, that is what my department in VET tried. If we would have a model in which we could all input, then we could communicate with each other and relate everything to everything else. The model is the boundary object. And models are interesting because they are kind of hybrids themselves. There's knowledge and data and concepts, and there is all kinds of social construction going on in the model. So but there are also frameworks and processes. Here's the model. I just want to highlight this great book, Models as Mediators. So, model as a tool for mediating different disciplinary interactions. You can see models is not just scientific content, it's also metaphors, analogies, and positive use also go into models because we select what is in the model and what is not there. At one point in time, our national economic models, it was decided not to include household labor in these models. So we made a bit of a problem there, perhaps. So we make socially, politically informed choices in how we design models. So that's why it's such a great tool, because you can do that differently. And you can try and make it in such a way that you can actually communicate with each other. Frameworks have the same function. Sometimes participatory processes have the function. So one of the things to do in interdisciplinarity is to ask what are the tools that we will use. We don't only need concepts. Academics always want to talk about theory and concept. But for interdisciplinarity, it's very important that you think about the actual tools that you use to facilitate that interaction. And there's a lot of interesting work on that. And the last one is boundary settings. This is all the internal and external organizational things that we have that need to be there to not constrain or to facilitate our interdisciplinary work. And it's a long list. And we tend to go for this in our discussions on interdisciplinarity. Yeah, the incentive structure is simply not in favor of interdisciplinarity, no matter what research funders say, etc. So these kinds of debates. There's a large literature on how do you manage interdisciplinary projects. What are the management styles that you can use? And there are many choices to be made. How do you facilitate communication? Where does interaction actually happen? Does it happen through shared databases, or does it happen at the coffee table in informal meetings? Well, one of my PhD students looked at this in the same project, and it doesn't happen to shared databases. They are just filled when needed, at least in this project. The actual interaction happened in much more informal settings. So what is the communication process? It's not self-evident at all, and you can shape it. So these are some of the internal boundary settings. Academics generally do not want to spend time and effort at thinking about these things when they design a project. They're focused on the substance, the issue, the problem, the theory, the methods, and possibly the impact. But this management thing, or this organizational thing, is not very popular in my admittedly limited experience. And external forms of collaboration are also very important, the relation with the outside world. Research funders particularly, there are wonderful papers about how research funding shapes the actual conduct of research. Who your partners, how do you choose your partners? What forms of knowledge do you want to develop? What is demanded, etc. Okay. So that's to summarize. Oh no, I'll skip this. So boundary work is analytical work for understanding the development of boundary concepts. It's instrumental work for action, the design and construction of boundary objects, and organizational work to facilitate the formative shaping of boundary settings. I mean, this is my framework. What I would kind of provocatively suggest is that our lack of interest in number 2 and number 3, at least in really academic settings, is somewhat worrying in my observation, and you can check that in the literature. Okay. To conclude, I want to end with a little bit more confusing, that in a way, confusing you. Boundary crossing, which is my central metaphor, is a partly misleading metaphor. And why is that? Because the crossing of boundaries to create new fields of study is actually also an act of boundary creation. We create new fields, and I mean, one of the wonderful examples is science and technology studies, which was a new field in the 1980s, which was very open, democratic, very dynamic. Then within 20 years developed its own journals and its own chairs and its own groups, and is now behaving exactly like a discipline. I'm afraid I'm involved in an exercise like that. For 20 years I've tried to establish a field called critical water studies, which we know, and we'll probably behave like a discipline if we are successful. Well, not everyone is successful in trying this, but if we are successful, I'm sure we'll create new boundaries. So exactly what is the logic of trying to be interdisciplinary if it ends up just in new bounded fields? Well, I think and I return to the beginning, I think there are two contributions to make, because interdisciplinarity, if it is done well, and well, that's a normative statement, how I think what is done well, it avoids tribalism and territorialism, and it defends permeability and plurality. An argument from science study is that what is the different logic should be the different logic in an interdiscipline is that you consistently organize it as being open and plural and diverse, because that is the only way to avoid kind of this closure that you so often get in science, and that makes life a lot more exciting, perhaps. So to conclude, the politics of interdisciplinary is twofold. It is both instrumental problem solving, addressing complex problems. That's nowadays very prominent. I would say it is also a defense of plurality and critical science and reflexivity, potentially, when it is done in a particular way. And I thank you for your attention, and this is an interdisciplinary act, swimming in an irrigation canal. Our hope is the youth of tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much.